My name is Margaret Holloway. I am 52 years old. All my life, I took pride in how calm and confident I felt behind the wheel. I taught my son that a driver must be the conscience of the road. But that night, I lost mine. I heard the impact, saw the silhouette on the asphalt, and still, I pressed the gas. Since then, even in silence, that sound is all I hear. And every morning, I wake up in the prison of my own guilt. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Margaret Holloway, and I was 52 years old when my life fractured in a way I could never piece back together. I worked as a receptionist in a dental office in Columbus, Ohio, spending my days answering phones, filing insurance forms, and guiding nervous patients to sterile chairs that smelled faintly of antiseptic and mint. It was not glamorous, but it was steady. My colleagues called me reliable, my neighbors thought of me as quiet, and my son said I was overly cautious, the kind of mother who checked the locks twice before bed and insisted on seatbelts even on short drives. For decades, I wore that image like a second skin, believing that caution was protection, that discipline was safety. But on that single night, everything I built collapsed because fear overtook reason and panic drowned out conscience. The evening had been long. I had stayed late at the office, reconciling a stack of unpaid bills, the numbers blurring on the computer screen. By the time I drove out of the small parking lot, the air was cold and sharp, the kind of Midwestern spring night where winter still lingered in the wind. I remember how the streetlights flickered as I pulled onto the main road, casting long shadows across empty sidewalks. My car smelled faintly of coffee and the lemon-scented wipes I used to keep the dashboard clean. I was proud of that little car, a silver sedan that had been with me for nearly a decade. It had never failed me, and I trusted it like an old companion. The highway was nearly deserted, a long stretch of asphalt broken only by the occasional truck roaring past. My fingers gripped the wheel more tightly than usual, as if bracing against something unseen. The radio murmured softly, but I barely listened, lost in thoughts of overdue rent, of my thinning savings account, of the way silence filled my house now that my son lived states away. I drove as I always did, 10 miles below the speed limit, eyes darting between mirrors and road, but no amount of vigilance prepared me for the suddenness of what happened. It was a shadow at first, a flicker at the edge of vision, too fast for my mind to make sense of. Then it became form. A man, stepping into the road from between two parked cars, his coat too dark to catch the weak light. I saw the outline of arms raised slightly, a startled movement, and then the sound came. The thud of impact was nothing like the movies where metal screeches and glass shatters. It was heavier, duller, a sound that seemed to reverberate inside my chest rather than outside. My body reacted before my brain. My foot slammed the brake, the steering wheel jerked under my hands, and then instinct, or terror, or some primal urge to escape, pressed the gas. I remember the way my heart raced so violently I thought it would break through my ribs. My eyes caught the rearview mirror, and for the briefest second, I saw something on the ground, a figure crumpled, motionless. My breath caught in my throat, and the sensible voice inside me whispered that I had to stop, had to go back, had to call for help. But another voice, louder, consumed with panic, screamed that if I stopped, my life would be over, that I would lose my job, my freedom, everything I had struggled to preserve. That second voice won. The road stretched before me like a tunnel of accusation, each yellow line blurring into the next. My hands were shaking so violently that the wheels slipped beneath them, and I had to clutch it tighter to keep the car steady. I felt as though I was driving through molasses, every second stretching into eternity. I kept waiting for flashing lights to appear behind me, for sirens to wail, for justice to descend immediately. But the night stayed eerily silent. The only sound was the hum of my tires and the rasp of my own uneven breathing. I thought of the rules I had taught my son when he first got his license. Never drink and drive. Always yield to pedestrians. If anything ever happens, you stop, no matter what. I had said those words with conviction, certain I was passing down a moral compass that would guide him. And yet here I was, breaking the most essential commandment I had ever spoken aloud. I was running not from a crime scene, but from myself, every sense heightened in that terrible drive home. The dashboard lights glowed too bright, accusing me with every flicker. The seatbelt pressed into my chest like a restraint rather than protection. I could smell the faint odor of rubber from the tires, or perhaps it was my imagination inventing the scent of burning guilt. My throat ached with unshed sobs, and I kept pressing my tongue against the roof of my mouth, as if I could hold back the tide of emotion that threatened to overwhelm me. By the time I turned onto the quiet residential street where I lived, the neighborhood looked foreign. Houses that once appeared safe and familiar now seemed judgmental, each darkened window a witness. The maple trees lining the road swayed in the wind, their branches scratching against one another like whispers. I parked in my driveway with trembling hands, unable to remember the last few blocks of the journey. My body moved mechanically as I shut off the engine, locked the doors, and stepped into the chill night air. The silence was suffocating. I stood for a long moment, staring at the car, half expecting to see some visible trace of what I had done. A dent, a smear of blood, shattered glass. But the metal gleamed coldly under the porch light, betraying nothing. The ordinary sight filled me with dread because it meant I could still pretend, at least outwardly, that nothing had happened. But inside, I already knew I would never escape it. I walked up the steps to my door, my legs heavy as if carrying chains. The key felt slippery in my grasp, though my hands were dry. When the lock clicked open, it sounded louder than it ever had before, echoing in my ears like a gavel striking wood. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, and the weight of the night collapsed onto my shoulders. My chest constricted, and I leaned against the wall, unable to breathe deeply. I told myself I would sort it out in the morning, that maybe it had not been as bad as I thought, that maybe the figure had only been grazed. I clung to those fragile lies like a drowning woman clings to driftwood. But deep down, in the marrow of my bones, I knew the truth. Something irreversible had happened on that dark road, and my choice to flee had carved it into my soul. That was the night everything changed. The night I became someone I no longer recognized. The night I pressed the gas pedal instead of facing what I had done. And no matter how many days passed afterward, I could still hear the sound, the heavy, awful thud that would forever divide my life into before and after. When I stepped inside that night, my house no longer embraced me the way it once had. The familiar scent of baked bread that usually lingered from weekends, the faint lemon polish I used on the wooden furniture, even the ticking of the old clock in the hallway, all of it felt alien. It was as if the walls themselves recoiled from me, no longer offering shelter, but standing as silent accusers. I had crossed a line, and the place that had been my refuge now bore witness to my betrayal. I set my purse on the small table near the door, though my hands trembled so badly that the keys clattered loudly against the surface. The sound echoed through the house in a way that made me flinch. I stood still in the dim entryway, trying to steady my breathing, but the silence pressed in around me. It was no longer comforting. It was suffocating, like the heavy blanket of guilt I could not shrug off. The living room looked exactly as I had left it that morning. The throw blanket folded neatly on the arm of the sofa, the stack of unopened mail on the coffee table, the lamp casting its usual soft glow. Nothing had changed outwardly, yet everything was wrong. I felt like a stranger trespassing in my own life. The air seemed thicker, charged with a tension only I could sense, as though the house itself knew what I had done and was bracing against my presence. I tried to go through the motions of a normal evening. I walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, hoping the cold light would calm me. The shelves were nearly empty, milk half gone, eggs in a carton, a few limp vegetables in the crisper drawer. My appetite had vanished the moment I stepped through the door, but I lingered there anyway, staring at the pale contents as though they might distract me from the image of the shadow crumpling on asphalt. The hum of the refrigerator was suddenly deafening, its steady vibration like an accusation that refused to stop. I shut the door quickly, the rubber seal making a hollow slap that seemed to reverberate through the room. I poured a glass of water, my fingers shaking so badly that droplets splashed onto the counter. I drank greedily, but the water did nothing to soothe me. It tasted metallic, like guilt itself had seeped into the pipes. I left the glass half full, unable to force another swallow past the lump in my throat. The sink dripped once, then again, each sound stretching into eternity. It was unbearable. I pressed my hands against the cool counter, forcing myself to breathe evenly, but my chest tightened with every attempt. I wandered upstairs, each creak of the wooden steps a reminder that I was not free. The photographs on the wall caught my eye, snapshots of a life that suddenly felt unrecognizable. My son as a child, holding his first bicycle. Myself, younger and smiling, standing beside a Christmas tree. My late husband with his arm around me, both of us caught in an embrace I could never return to. Those frames had once been a source of comfort, evidence of love and continuity. Now they felt like relics mocking the person I used to believe I was. I couldn't bear to look at them, so I turned my face away, but the images remained branded in my mind. In the bedroom, I tried to settle into bed, thinking perhaps exhaustion would finally drag me into oblivion. But the mattress felt hard, unwelcoming, as if it rejected the weight of my body. The sheets were clean, the pillowcases freshly laundered, yet they smelled faintly of detergent that stung my nose, sharp and unnatural. I lay flat on my back, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to the relentless ticking of the clock on the nightstand. Each second was a hammer pounding into my skull, marking the time since I had made the choice to run. Sleep did not come. When I closed my eyes, the darkness was not empty, but filled with flashes. Headlights, a figure stepping out, the hollow sound of impact. My body jerked involuntarily, as though reliving the moment again and again. I turned onto my side, pressing the pillow over my head to muffle the noise of memory, but the silence underneath it was worse. It was the kind of silence that screamed, a silence too heavy to escape. I rose again, unable to stay still, and paced the length of the room. The carpet muffled my steps, but I still felt as though I was being watched. I pulled back the curtain slightly and peered out into the street. It was empty, the houses across the way dark, cars lined neatly along the curb. No one stirred, yet I could not shake the certainty that someone knew, that the world outside was waiting for me to confess, that the night itself carried my secret like a whisper ready to spread. I let the curtain fall back into place, my hand trembling as though I had touched something hot. The hours dragged by, each one indistinguishable from the last. I sat in the armchair in the corner, wrapping the blanket around myself, though I was not cold. I listened to the faint hum of the furnace, the occasional groan of the old house settling. Sounds I had lived with for years now startled me, each one magnified into accusation. I imagined footsteps approaching the door, imagined sirens piercing the night, imagined the phone ringing with news that the man I had struck had died. My mind spun in relentless circles, and no matter how many times I told myself to breathe, I could not find air deep enough to ease the pressure in my chest. By dawn, the house was drenched in gray light, the kind that flattened everything into monotony. My body ached from the tension. My eyes burned from lack of sleep. I shuffled to the kitchen and brewed coffee, though the smell of it turned my stomach. I sat at the table with the steaming mug untouched before me, staring at the wood grain as if it could offer answers. The walls that had once cocooned me now felt like prison bars. There was no safety here, no comfort, only reminders. Every corner of that house carried the weight of my choice. The hallway smelled of polish, but it no longer shone with pride. The living room's softness now mocked me with its false calm. The bedroom, the kitchen, even the silence itself, all of it had turned against me. My home had been stripped of warmth, hollowed out by the secret I carried. I realized then that I could not outrun what I had done. The walls might stand, the roof might shelter, but I was already exiled from the only true comfort a home can give, peace of mind. From that night onward, I no longer lived inside those walls. I only existed within them, moving like a shadow through rooms that remembered who I used to be, while I carried the unbearable weight of who I had become. It was a Tuesday morning when the news found me. The day had begun like any other, gray light slanting through the blinds, the air stale with the smell of brewed coffee that I could not bring myself to drink. I sat at the kitchen table, the silence of the house pressing on me with the weight of stone, when I unfolded the thin local newspaper that had been tossed onto my porch. It was a ritual I had followed for years, one of the small consistencies in a life built around routine. But that morning, the words on the page carved themselves into my memory like scars. The headline was simple, almost detached, yet to me it carried the force of a sentence. Local man dies after hit and run. Beneath it was a small photograph, a man with kind eyes and a tired smile, standing beside a woman whose hand rested gently on his arm. Between them, a little girl grinned, her front teeth missing, her joy unfiltered. My eyes froze on that picture. It was not just a story. It was him. It was the shadow on the road. It was the figure I had left behind. The article was brief. His name was Andrew Miller, 36 years old, a factory worker who had finished his late shift and was walking home. He had been struck on a dimly lit street by a car that did not stop. He had been rushed to the hospital, clinging to life for days, before succumbing to his injuries. He left behind a wife, Clara, and their daughter, Emily. The police were asking for information, urging anyone who had seen something to come forward. There was no description of the car, No witnesses, only the words "driver" fled the scene, a phrase that felt like a blade twisted in my chest. I read it once, twice, over and over, as if repetition might dull the impact. But the more I read, the deeper the guilt burrowed into me. My hands shook so badly that the paper rattled like dry leaves in the wind. I pressed it flat against the table, but the photograph stared back at me, unrelenting. That little girl's smile pierced through me, her innocence a mirror to my cowardice. I had stolen something from her that could never be returned, and no punishment, no apology, could restore what I had taken. I tried to look away, but the words followed me into every corner of the house. When I stood at the sink, they echoed in the dripping of the faucet. When I walked down the hall, they whispered in the ticking of the clock. Local man dies. Driver fled. My life had shrunk to those two sentences. I carried them with me like stones in my chest, heavy and unmovable. The rest of the day blurred around me. I did not remember eating. I did not remember moving from room to room. I only remembered the photograph, that small family frozen in happier times, a family I had shattered. I thought of the widow, her nights now stretched into unbearable emptiness. I thought of the child, her father's absence a wound she would never understand. And I thought of myself, sitting in a kitchen that no longer felt like mine, breathing air that tasted of ashes. In the following days, I avoided the newspaper, but the story found me regardless. On the local news channel, his name scrolled across the screen as the anchor's voice recounted the tragedy. At the grocery store, two women whispered near the produce aisle, their faces solemn as they spoke of the hit and run. At work, someone left a donation jar at the front desk, Andrew Miller's photograph taped to it, urging people to contribute to his grieving family. I wanted to leave money, but I could not bring myself to approach the jar. My guilt was not currency, it was poison. Even in sleep, the news haunted me. I dreamed of the photograph, of the child's smile fading into silence, of the woman's eyes hollow with grief. Sometimes I woke gasping, convinced that the paper was still in my hands, the ink smudging under my trembling fingers. Other times I woke to the sound of my own voice whispering apologies into the darkness, words that no one would hear, words that would change nothing. The knowledge that he had died transformed my fear into something deeper, heavier. Before I had clung to the fragile hope that perhaps he had survived, that perhaps the damage I had done could somehow be undone. But with his death, that illusion collapsed. There was no undoing. There was no hope. There was only permanence, and permanence was unbearable. I tried to go about my days as though nothing had shifted, but every action was tainted. Folding laundry felt obscene, as if clean shirts could erase blood. Cooking a meal felt pointless, as if nourishment could disguise the emptiness inside me. Even the sunlight streaming through the window seemed cruel, casting brightness onto a life that no longer deserved light. What broke me most was the detail in the article that described how Andrew Miller had worked double shifts to save for his daughter's future. The words painted him as a man of sacrifice, a man who endured long hours and exhaustion to ensure his child had opportunities he himself had never known. That small fact gutted me. I had not just taken a man's life, I had stolen a father's love from his daughter, a husband's devotion from his wife. My act was not only cowardice, it was a theft beyond measure. I stopped turning on the television. I stopped answering the phone. I stopped reading the mail that piled on the table. The world outside was filled with reminders of the life I had destroyed, and I could not bear to face them. My house became darker, the blinds pulled closed, the air heavy with neglect. I moved through it like a ghost, existing but not living, haunted by the truth I refused to speak. But the truth seeped into everything. It was in the way my hands trembled when I held a cup. It was in the way my chest constricted when I heard children's laughter in the street. It was in the way I startled at every knock on the door, certain that someone had discovered me. The news had not just found me, it had bound itself to me, a chain I could not break. In the stillness of the night, I often unfolded that newspaper again, smoothing its creases with shaking hands. The ink had begun to fade from the number of times I had touched it, but the photograph never lost its power. I stared at that family until tears blurred my vision, until my throat ached with suppressed sobs. I told myself I deserved to look, deserved to suffer, deserved to drown in the image of what I had ruined. And as the days turned into weeks, I realized something that terrified me more than discovery. I realized that I could not forgive myself, and I did not want to. Forgiveness felt like a betrayal to them, to him, to the child whose life I had stolen a piece of. The news had found me once, but now it lived inside me. It was not just a story in the paper, it was my truth, and I carried it like a wound that would never heal. I returned to work the following Monday, as if nothing had changed, though I knew that everything had. I buttoned my blouse with trembling fingers, brushed my hair back with more care than usual, and applied a thin layer of makeup, not to look presentable, but to hide the pallor of guilt clinging to my skin. In the mirror, I saw a woman I barely recognized, her eyes dulled and too wide, her mouth tight with secrets. Still, I smiled at that reflection, practiced and rehearsed, like slipping into a role I no longer believed in. The office was the same as it had always been. The humming of printers, the faint scent of disinfectant, the soft thud of footsteps on worn carpet. Patients came and went with predictable rhythm, flipping through outdated magazines, scrolling through their phones, calling me by name with polite indifference. I answered phones with a steady voice, scheduled appointments, and typed insurance claims like clockwork. No one looked at me any differently. No one asked about my weekend. No one noticed the slight tremor in my hands or the way I flinched whenever a siren screamed faintly through the streets outside. Every smile I offered was a mask, every polite exchange a form of self-preservation. I laughed when expected, nodded at stories I didn't hear, offered sympathy to those complaining about cavities or copays. But beneath that performance, I was unraveling. My thoughts never strayed far from the article, the photo, the guilt. I carried it in my spine, in the tightness behind my eyes, in the constant weight that sat on my chest like a stone. I had become two people, the Margaret who showed up every day and the Margaret who lived in quiet torment, waiting for the truth to break through the thin veil of normalcy. Even my movements became carefully curated. I walked slightly slower, more deliberately, as if rushing might betray the urgency I felt inside. I lowered my voice, softened my tone, took fewer breaks, fearing solitude would open the floodgates. When coworkers laughed during lunch, I joined in with a noise that mimicked laughter but held no warmth. I avoided mirrors, avoided eye contact, avoided anything that might reflect who I really was. The worst moments were the mornings before the building opened. I arrived early, unlocking the glass door, with keys that jingled far too loudly in the silence. The reception area would be dimly lit, bathed in the soft pink haze of sunrise, and for those few minutes, I was alone with the sound of my breathing and the faint creak of the heating vents. I would stand behind the desk, stare at the rows of patient folders, and imagine what it would be like to confess, to walk into the police station, to speak my truth, to face the weight of justice head on. But each time the thought formed, it was chased away by fear, the fear of losing what little I had left, the fear of the unknown, the fear of what others would say. I began avoiding the break room. The sight of coworkers chatting about their children or vacations was unbearable. Their lives moved forward, undisturbed, untouched by tragedy. Mine had stalled, though I kept it running like a broken machine, pretending function in the absence of feeling. Instead of lunch, I nibbled on dry granola bars in the privacy of my car. Windows cracked just slightly, my fingers drumming the steering wheel as I stared into nothing. Driving had become its own kind of penance. Every time I sat behind the wheel, my hands tightened involuntarily, and my eyes scanned the road not just for hazards, but for ghosts. I slowed at every crosswalk, lingered at yellow lights, and braked too early, too often, as though trying to rewrite the past with every cautious gesture. My car no longer felt like mine. It had become an accomplice, a vessel of shame, carrying me from one silent act to another. At home, I stripped off the mask, but the face underneath was no easier to wear. The silence there was heavier, no longer an absence of sound, but a presence in itself, looming and watchful. I moved through the rooms like a visitor, touching objects that once meant something. A photograph, a mug, a cardigan hanging on the back of a chair, and finding them foreign. The house had ceased to offer comfort. Now it only mirrored my emptiness back at me. I began sleeping in fits, waking with a jolt to the sound of my name spoken in dreams, to the phantom screech of tires, to the echo of that one unspoken moment. Some nights I wandered the house barefoot, touching walls, running fingers along the ridges of door frames, grounding myself in texture when thought became unbearable. I opened and closed cabinets without reason. I stood in the laundry room watching the dryer spin, hypnotized by the motion, wishing I could be as easily emptied and turned anew. Guilt became a rhythm. It moved through me like breath. It accompanied me to the grocery store, where I stared too long at a toddler in a pink coat and had to abandon my cart. It followed me to the mailbox, where I hesitated before touching envelopes, imagining that each might contain the truth, delivered in bold letters. It climbed into bed with me at night and whispered questions I could not answer. I told myself I could live like this, that so long as no one knew, I could continue pretending. I told myself that guilt was punishment enough, that perhaps if I suffered silently, if I lived quietly, the scales would somehow balance. But each day under the mask made me smaller. I shrank in conversations, in gestures, in appetite, in sleep. I became a version of myself that barely cast a shadow. Sometimes I imagined a different life, one where I had stopped the car, one where I had called for help, one where I had waited by his side until the ambulance came. I replayed those fantasies with obsessive detail, as if they could overwrite what had actually happened. But reality always returned, quiet, patient, undeniable. And the mask I wore began to crack, fine lines forming at the edges, no longer able to contain the truth festering beneath. There were no bruises on my skin, no visible scars, but I lived in a state of constant fracture. I had buried my secret in silence, thinking that would make it disappear. Instead, it grew in the dark, taking root in every aspect of my life, twisting itself into everything I touched. Life under the mask was not life at all. It was survival in its most hollow form. And with each passing day, I wondered how much longer I could keep pretending I didn't already know the answer. The day I saw them was a day like any other, which somehow made it worse. It was late afternoon, the sun low and flat across the parking lot of a grocery store I had visited countless times. The air was heavy with the mingled smells of gasoline, asphalt, and fading autumn leaves. My cart squeaked with every step, a small mechanical groan that echoed in the quiet of my head. I had gone there for bread and milk, the most ordinary errands. But the moment I turned the corner of the lot, I felt the world shift beneath me. They were standing near the entrance, a woman and a child, their backs to the sliding doors as people passed by without notice. She held a reusable shopping bag in one hand and the girl's small fingers in the other. The bag sagged under the weight of groceries, but her shoulders sagged heavier. Her hair was pulled back hastily, stray strands catching the sunlight, and her coat looked too thin for the chill. The girl wore a pink sweater with a faded unicorn stitched on the front. She was humming to herself, swinging the bag she held in the other hand, oblivious to the tiredness etched into her mother's posture. I stopped moving, my cart still in the middle of the lane, wheels cocked. It was her, Clara, and Emily. The names from the article, the faces from the photograph I had stared at until my eyes blurred. They were no longer ink on paper. They were living, breathing, hurting right in front of me. The scene unfolded slowly, every detail searing itself into my mind. The way Clara adjusted the strap on her shoulder, the way Emily's shoes were scuffed at the toes, the way the afternoon light painted a fragile halo around them both. My throat constricted. The air felt colder suddenly, as if the season had changed in a single breath. My hands trembled on the cart handle, and my chest filled with a heaviness I could no longer hold back. I wanted to move toward them, to close the distance, to fall to my knees and pour out every hidden word that had burned inside me since that night. I wanted to tell Clara that I had stolen from her something immeasurable, that I had watched her life from the shadows while she bore the weight of loss alone. But my feet rooted themselves to the asphalt, as if the ground itself held me in place. I watched Emily tug at her mother's hand, pointing at something in the window, a display of pumpkins, bright and fat with cheerful faces painted on them. Her excitement was small but pure. Clara bent to listen, a shadow of a smile flickering at the corner of her mouth, but her eyes were distant, dulled by a grief that had settled like dust over everything she touched. I wondered what their nights were like now, whether Emily woke crying for a father who would never come back, whether Clara lay awake listening to the silence that followed his absence. People moved around me, carts rolling, car doors slamming, footsteps echoing off concrete. The world went on, blind to the collision of two lives in one unremarkable parking lot. I felt myself shrinking, my breath shallow, my palms slick with sweat. All the lies I had told myself cracked and fell away. It was no longer a story on a page or a nightmare in my head. It was a mother and a child, standing in the waning light, living out the consequences of what I had done. A bird landed on a lamppost nearby, its feathers ruffled against the wind, its head tilting as if to watch me. That small, ordinary motion struck me with unbearable force. Even the bird seemed freer than I was, perched lightly above the scene, unburdened. I wished I could shed my guilt as easily as feathers. Instead, it clung to me like a second skin, heavy and damp, unrelenting. I turned away, but my legs were slow, each step dragging through the thickness of shame. I abandoned my cart near a row of cars, groceries forgotten. My heart pounded in my ears as I walked back to mine, fumbling for the keys with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. The metal of the door handle burned against my palm, though the air was cool. Inside the car, I sat with the engine off, staring through the windshield at nothing. My breath fogged the glass, blurring the outlines of the world beyond. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and closed my eyes. In the darkness behind my lids, images flickered. The crumpled figure on the road, the headline, Clara's hollowed eyes, Emily's pink sweater. They looped endlessly, no beginning, no end, only a circle of my own making. For a moment I imagined stepping out of the car, walking back to them, tapping Clara on the shoulder and telling her the truth. I imagined her face turning toward me, confusion, recognition, horror. I imagined Emily clutching her mother's coat, wide-eyed and silent. I imagined police cars, handcuffs, courtrooms, but beneath all those visions was another, the possibility, however small, of some release, not forgiveness, not redemption, but release from the suffocating mask I had worn so long. I did not move. The vision faded, replaced by the reality of my stillness, the hum of distant traffic, the faint smell of fabric softener from the blanket crumpled in the back seat. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but they did not fall. It was as if even my grief had become frozen, locked behind the same walls as my guilt. I started the engine and drove away slowly, merging into the stream of cars like a leaf carried along a current. The parking lot disappeared in the rearview mirror, but the image of them did not. It settled inside me like a weight I could never set down. My chest hurt from holding it. My shoulders hunched as though trying to bear an invisible load. That night at home, the walls felt closer than ever. The clock's ticking was louder, the air heavier. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands flat on the wood, and stared at the empty chair across from me. For the first time, I did not try to imagine that I could go on like this indefinitely. For the first time, I understood that the secret was not protecting me. It was destroying me from the inside out. Seeing them had stripped away the last layer of denial. The truth was no longer something I could push into a corner of my mind. It stood in the center of the room, solid and undeniable. I could not unsee Clara's face or Emily's. I could not unhear the silence between them. The collision on that dark road had not ended with the sound of impact. It had echoed outward, tearing through lives like invisible shrapnel, and I was at the center of it all. That realization settled over me with a grim kind of clarity. I had been living in a cage of my own making, and the bars were tightening. As the night deepened, I sat motionless, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a dog outside, the faint rush of cars on the highway beyond my street. Each sound seemed to mark the passing of time, each second another reminder that I was still free while they were not. The imbalance was unbearable. My hands curled into fists on the table, nails pressing crescents into my palms. In that moment, I knew that something had to change. Not tomorrow, not someday, but soon. The confrontation with the truth had happened, and there was no retreat from it. My mask had cracked beyond repair, and the person underneath it, the real me, the guilty me, was exposed. Whether I wanted it or not, the time for hiding was ending. The morning I walked into the police station, the sky was the same muted gray as the concrete steps beneath my feet. A thin drizzle clung to my hair and coat, beating on the fabric, soaking into the seams of my shoes. I had not slept the night before. I had not slept for many nights, but this time the insomnia carried a strange calm, like the stillness that settles over a field after a storm. My body moved on its own, rising before dawn, dressing without thought, leaving my house as if guided by a hand beyond my own. I did not lock the door. The key hung useless from my fingers until I slipped it into my coat pocket. The station loomed ahead, a square building of glass and stone, its flag limp in the damp air. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed with a low electric drone that seeped into my bones. The floor smelled faintly of disinfectant and wet paper, a scent that reminded me of hospitals and waiting rooms. My shoes squeaked as I crossed the lobby, each step loud, deliberate, impossible to hide. I had spent months hiding, moving like a shadow, but that morning there was no shadow left to slip into. A man behind a desk looked up, his expression neutral and tired, the look of someone who had heard every story the world had to offer. I approached him with my heart pounding, not like a drum, but like a fist knocking from the inside of my chest. When I opened my mouth, no sound came at first. My throat was dry, my tongue heavy. Finally the words emerged, a rasped confession, as if they had been waiting all along for this moment to claw their way free. I spoke of the night, of the road, of the sound of impact. I spoke of the fear that had driven me to press the gas instead of the brake, of the weeks spent suffocating under a mask of normalcy, of the image of a little girl in a pink sweater and a woman whose eyes had been hollowed by grief. Each word felt like a stone lifted from my chest, but also like a cut against my own skin. I did not ask for forgiveness. I did not justify or explain. I only told it as it was, letting the silence between sentences hold all that could not be said. The man behind the desk did not interrupt. He only nodded occasionally, his pen scratching across a pad. At some point, another officer came, a woman with kind eyes that did not soften her professionalism. She guided me to a small room with a metal table and 2 chairs. The walls were pale, almost the color of ashes. I sat with my hands folded tightly in my lap, staring at the grain of the tabletop as they asked me questions. I answered all of them, my voice steady now, as if the act of speaking had released something caged inside me. Hours passed, forms were filled, fingerprints taken, photographs snapped. The camera flash was harsh, bleaching me of color, but I did not flinch. My hands were inked and pressed to paper, each whirl and line of my skin captured as evidence. I thought of how those same hands had once braided my son's hair when he was small, had written grocery lists, had held a steering wheel steady through storms. Now they trembled slightly as they rested on the cool metal surface, no longer hiding what they had done. When they led me to a holding cell, the door closing with a sound like a slow exhale, I felt no panic. The cinder-block walls smelled faintly of bleach and dust. A narrow bench jutted from the wall, its surface hard but clean. I sat down and clasped my knees, lowering my head until my forehead touched the rough fabric of my skirt. My heart still beat fast, but not with fear. It beat with something else, something closer to grief and release entwined. I thought of Clara and Emily. I imagined them at home, the girl at the kitchen table drawing pictures with crayons, the mother staring at a mug of cold tea. They did not know where I was, did not know that the person who had shattered their lives was now behind these walls. My confession would not bring Andrew back. It would not erase the nights they had wept alone. It would not give Emily her father's hand to hold, or Clara her husband's warmth beside her in bed. The truth I had spoken was not a gift to them. It was an obligation to the dead, to the living, and to the self I had betrayed. The cell was silent except for the faint hum of the building's ventilation. I traced the pattern of small holes in the vent cover with my eyes, following each row until my vision blurred. In that blur, I saw the dark road again, but this time I did not look away. I saw the shape on the pavement, the stillness, the emptiness afterward. I let the image settle over me, heavy but no longer unbearable. It was no longer a secret I carried alone. It was out in the world now, anchored by ink and record and process. As the hours turned to evening, the narrow window high on the wall glowed with the faint orange of sunset. Dust motes drifted in the beam of light like tiny ghosts, rising and falling in a slow dance. I breathed deeply, the first full breath in months. It did not taste of freedom. It tasted of something harder to name, perhaps honesty, perhaps surrender. I sat upright and clasped my hands, feeling the pulse beat through my fingers. The mask I had worn for so long was gone, stripped away by my own choice. In its place there was no redemption as the world might define it, no clean slate or absolution. There was only this, a small raw space inside me where the truth had finally taken root, where the endless circling of guilt had found a point of stillness. I knew the legal process ahead would be long. There would be hearings, sentencing, newspapers again, whispers in the grocery store. My name would be spoken with disgust, my photograph printed beneath headlines. I would lose my job, my home, perhaps my son's respect. None of it frightened me as much as the silence of the past months had. None of it seemed heavier than living under a lie. As the light in the cell faded, I closed my eyes. The bench was hard beneath me, the air cool against my skin, but my body eased into it, muscles loosening as if finally allowed to rest. I did not think of freedom. I did not think of punishment. I thought only of the truth sitting quietly between my ribs, a painful but steady presence. This was redemption, but not the kind that restores. It was not an exchange or a pardon. It was simply the act of standing still in the wreckage and refusing to run any farther. It was the smallest of steps, but it was the only one left to take. I felt it settle inside me, heavy and cold, yet strangely clean. And for the first time since that night, I let myself weep, not for myself, but for the life that could never return.